Allow me, if I may, to begin by taking a righteous swipe at the juvenile canard that has circulated for some time in the digital ether. Epstein didn't kill himself. This inane refrain, repeated with meme-like glee, is the product of that particular brand of internet cynicism that conflates conspiratorial daydreams with social commentary. The notion that Jeffrey Epstein was, depending on one's paranoid persuasion, spirited away by an invisible cabal of power-hungry elites or murdered under shadowy circumstances by G-men determined to staunch the flow of salacious secrets, is a perfect encapsulation of our modern inability, or indeed unwillingness, to accept simple if deeply unpleasant truths. Let us for a brief moment entertain the basic facts. Jeffrey Epstein was a thoroughly deplorable character, a vile manipulator, a sexual predator whose monstrous appetites had for years been shielded by ill-gotten social capital. He cultivated friendships with the great, the good, and the unscrupulous, though in the harsh light of a prison cell, the distinction between the respectable and the condemnable becomes moot. Once indicted and thrown behind the unlovely bars of justice, he discovered that the illusions of power and privilege evaporate quickly when you are no longer at the top of the food chain, but instead a caged curiosity with a neon arrow blinking overhead that reads, "Here stands a loathsome piece of work." It is precisely that knowledge that he would never again stroll unmolested through the world, would never again enjoy the plush, hush-hush courtesies of high society deference, that must have made him acutely aware of his predicament. To many, the horror of indefinite incarceration might be little more than an abstract notion, but to the person who feels the clang of the steel door behind him, the soul-crushing finality is plain as day. You could be locked in a bare, coffin-sized cube for the next 10, 20, or 1,000 years. For any rational being, especially one accustomed to the best that stolen or ill-used money can buy, this is a psychic collapse waiting to happen. Consider the famous line from the great Christopher Marlowe in Dr. Faustus. "Why this is hell, nor am I out of it." If the hell of incarceration burns with such perpetual torment, imagine how it might sear the mind of a man whose entire empire, built on blackmail and exploitation, is collapsing before his eyes. Even the thickest-skulled narcissist is forced to confront the stark possibility of permanent infamy, or if not infamy, at least humiliating insignificance as yet another local inmate shuffling along the corridor to receive a miserable ration of watery eggs. For Epstein, a man who trafficked in illusions of his own power and importance, this alone would be enough to prompt fatal introspection. Now, to those who argue that some labyrinthine conspiracy was set in motion to snuff out the man before he could start naming names or providing juicy depositions that might drag others down with him, I will say this. The simplest explanation is quite often the correct one. Yes, one can conjure stories of a smiling assassin, cunningly disguised as a bored guard, skulking into the cell at the hour of the wolf. But these tall tales are generally spun by those who haven't the faintest clue what it's like to be in a maximum security facility, and who evidently have never studied the tragically routine nature of prison suicides. Especially among the notorious, the isolation can be so intense, the shame so overwhelming, that the noose is frequently seen as the only exit. If it strains one's credulity that Epstein found the means and motivation to end his own life while behind bars, that is perhaps more a commentary on how little we as a society understand the grim logistics of incarceration. We imagine cameras rolling endlessly, capturing every blink and breath, guards hovering like hawks, ensuring that the high-profile detainee is safe from all harm. But those who have had the misfortune to experience such a setting can tell you how the real world works. Prison staff is overworked, undertrained, often indifferent, and in all too many cases, simply incompetent. The system was never intended to be a paragon of attentive care. It is a barely functioning house of sticks that cannot even ensure hygienic living conditions, let alone detect and prevent each and every desperate act of self-harm. Of course, I don't mean to exonerate that system, nor do I intend to dismiss the deeply dysfunctional nature of any correctional institution, but that's just the point, isn't it? We prefer a grand and diabolical scheme because it flatters our sense of intrigue and importance. Suddenly, the entire fiasco is not about one pitiful man's last act of moral surrender, but about us, the self-appointed detectives of cyberspace, proving our cunning knowledge that they manipulated the puppet strings. In short, it is easier and more dramatic to believe in murder than to accept that, in the final reckoning, Epstein was so broken by his own predicament that he used the only means left to seize control of his fate. If there is a final indignity, it is that his end, in some sense, was almost anticlimactic. The sensational headlines have since crescendoed into ephemeral rumour, as ephemeral as his wealth and celebrity. One might be tempted to think that a man so cunning, so adept at wriggling through the corridors of high influence, would die in a final blaze of ultra-spectacle. Instead, the final image is pathetically ordinary. A terrified wretch, robbed of illusions, choosing strangulation by bed linen over the slow suffocation of a life behind bars. We should not, in our rush to debunk or to scoff at the gullible, lose sight of an important fact. The man was, by all credible standards, a malignant figure who destroyed lives for his own depraved gratification. As such, there is no reason to exalt his demise with the glamour of assassins and shadow conspiracies. The truth is far more in line with what we understand from history and psychology. Men who build empires on corruption and exploitation often think themselves immune to the reckoning. Then the day of judgment arrives, and stripped of their illusions, they discover a more prosaic horror. There is no honourable or grand exit. No great Oz revealing grand illusions behind the curtain. Just a petty, dreadful final gasp of a life spent in monstrous pursuits. Thus, the next time you see that hackneyed phrase, "Epstein didn't kill himself," consider the possibility that such a mimetic slogan might be nothing more than a cheap amuse-bouche of conspiratorial junk food, a mental Twinkie for those seeking drama rather than digesting the dull, bleak reality. For those of us who prefer the simpler and, indeed, the starker explanation, Jeffrey Epstein's demise requires neither sinister cloak-and-dagger theatrics nor cameo appearances by fictitious spooks. He was an odious man, finally cornered, choosing a banal end in the face of intolerable shame and certain imprisonment, an animal chewing off its own leg to escape the steel trap of consequences he had set for himself. So, yes, Jeffrey Epstein really did kill himself. And for all the moral, legal, and philosophical debates we can have about the structure of the criminal justice system, about the rot of the social elites who enabled him, or about the teenage-level titillation that conspiracies offer, perhaps this plain truth is a more fitting epitaph for his vile life. The man ended as he had lived, consumed by self-interest, convinced there was no future, and hoist with the only petard he had left, which was the abrupt severance of his miserable existence. That is not glamorous, that is not conspiratorial, but it is tragically human. And it is, if we can muster the honesty, self-evidently true.